I spent a week in a coma, hanging by a thread between life and death. When I finally opened my eyes, I wasn't welcomed by my husband's embrace, but by a crumpled piece of paper on the side table. "Pay the hospital bill yourself. You're nothing but dead weight." I cried for hours, feeling like my world was crumbling after being abandoned by the man I had given everything to, until a mysterious man in an impeccable suit walked into my room and said, "Dry your tears. Your husband just threw away a diamond to bend down and pick up a rock from the pavement." Before the story begins, type in the comments which city you're listening from, and don't forget to leave a like and subscribe so this channel can keep growing and bringing you even more intense stories. The strong smell of antiseptic was the first thing that woke Vesper's senses. When she started to regain consciousness, her eyelids felt heavy, as if someone had placed tons of lead on them. Her whole body ached, stiff, joints numb, after a sleep that had lasted too long. With effort, she forced herself to open her eyes. The white fluorescent light on the ceiling blinded her, forcing her to blink several times until she adjusted. The monotonous hum of the air conditioner filled the dense silence of the room. Vesper moved her fingers a little to make sure she was still alive and that she still had control over her own body. Her memories were blurry, just flashes of a terrible pain in her head. And then, darkness. She slowly turned her face to the right, expecting to find Drayton, her husband, asleep in the chair, maybe holding her hand, watching over her. For 5 years of marriage, Vesper had strived to be a devoted and attentive wife. She imagined Drayton desperate, worried, praying for her recovery. But that hope shattered in a second when her gaze swept the room. It was empty. The visitor's chair, perfectly placed in a corner, looked like it hadn't been used in a long time. There were no flowers, no fruit baskets, no get-well-soon cards, and most painfully, no sign of Drayton. Vesper's heart shrank. Fear began to rise in her chest. How long had she been unconscious? Why wasn't her husband there when she woke up? Her throat burned with thirst. She wanted to call a nurse, but her voice got stuck. Then she saw the paper on the nightstand next to a glass of water, covered by a thin layer of dust. It was a sheet torn hurriedly from a notebook, folded in two without an envelope. With a trembling hand, weak and scared, she stretched her fingers until she reached it. Something inside her screamed that there was something very wrong with that message. Her heart pounded in her chest with painful force. She unfolded the sheet slowly. She immediately recognized Drayton's rushed, jagged handwriting. She read the first sentence, and the air got stuck in her lungs. The message was brutal, no chaser. She had to pay all the hospital expenses herself when she woke up. The next line was even crueler. He wrote that Vesper only served to complicate his life. At the end, a cold and brief goodbye. He was leaving and didn't plan to ever come back to take care of a sickly wife. The paper slipped from her fingers and fell to the floor. For Vesper, the entire world collapsed in that instant. The tears she had tried to hold back flowed uncontrollably down her sunken cheeks. Her sobs broke the frozen silence of the room. The physical pain of waking up from a coma was nothing compared to what was tearing her chest apart. She cried inconsolably, mourning her luck. She remembered every sacrifice she had made, how she accepted living simply, how she saved every single dollar for their future, how she bent over backwards to attend to Drayton, how she gave in time and time again to his massive ego. And the payment for all of that had been abandonment in her moment of greatest vulnerability. Being treated like a nuisance and tossed out like trash. She felt like the most naive woman in the world for having loved a man like him. The tick-tock of the wall clock marked the hours while Vesper sank into endless weeping. Her eyes were swollen, her breathing ragged, and she felt a sensation of absolute emptiness. She had no parents, no siblings left. Now she was husbandless too. She felt completely alone, with no reason to keep living. At the peak of her despair, when she could only stare blankly at the ceiling, she heard the door handle turn. She didn't move. She thought it would be a nurse checking her IV or a doctor irritated about the unpaid bills. But the footsteps that entered were firm, confident, different from the rushed steps of the staff. The figure approached her bed. The scent of expensive, elegant cologne began to displace the smell of medicine. Vesper turned her head slowly and saw a middle-aged black man standing tall next to her bed. He wore a perfectly tailored suit, his hair groomed with care, already speckled with gray, and his face radiated both serenity and authority. He didn't look at her with pity or superiority, but with a mix of respect and sincere concern. Vesper was bewildered. She didn't know him. Was he someone from administration about to demand the hospital payment? She hurried to wipe her tears with the back of her hand, trying to look strong even though inside she felt shattered to pieces. She braced herself to hear how they were kicking her out, but the man just offered a slight, reassuring smile. He bowed his body slightly with an old-school courtesy and spoke in a deep but soft voice. He introduced himself as Mr. Sterling. Vesper remained silent, waiting for his explanation. He cast a fleeting glance at the paper lying on the floor, Drayton's letter, and then looked back into her eyes. "Don't shed one more tear for that trash," he said calmly. "Your husband just threw away a diamond to go pick up rocks from the street." The phrase hit her like a slap, but at the same time, it sounded strangely true. Mr. Sterling took a step closer, and with a tone loaded with intention added, "Drayton just made the biggest mistake of his life, because he has no idea who you really are." Those words made Vesper's skin crawl. It was as if this man knew a secret about her own life. She looked at him with a furrowed brow, unable to reconcile her reality as an apparently poor and lonely woman with such a metaphor about diamonds. For years, she had seen herself as an orphan struggling to survive in the city before meeting Drayton 5 years ago. She never had clear memories of her childhood, just blurry fragments she could never fit together. She had always attributed that void to trauma from an accident Drayton had told her about. With a hoarse voice, Vesper asked Mr. Sterling to explain what those words about diamonds and rocks meant. He pulled a chair from the corner of the room, placed it next to the bed, and sat down without losing his upright and respectful posture. He began to speak carefully but clearly. He told her that 5 years ago, she had suffered a very serious accident that caused partial amnesia. In the middle of the chaos, she got separated from her true family. Drayton, who was either passing by chance or perhaps had it all planned, appeared as a savior hero. Since Vesper didn't remember who she was or where she came from, she clung to him as her only lifeline. Drayton took advantage of that dependence to convince her she had no one else in the world, making her feel indebted to him as if she owed him her life. Vesper listened with her mouth slightly open, feeling the pieces of a long, incomplete puzzle starting to fit. She remembered how many times Drayton had repeated that thanks to him she was alive, that without him she would be nobody. Those phrases had kept her obedient and submissive, as if every whim of her husband was a fair price for having saved her. Mr. Sterling then pulled a digital tablet out of his briefcase. When he turned on the screen, several photographs of Vesper's past appeared. She saw herself, but different. Designer clothes, a radiant smile, standing next to an older man with an imposing presence. Mr. Sterling explained that man was her biological father, Langston Vance, a mogul who owned a conglomerate of companies operating in various sectors. Vesper felt her heart skip a beat when she heard that her father had died 2 years ago, sick, without ever stopping the search for his missing daughter. Mr. Sterling was Mr. Vance's right-hand man, entrusted with continuing the search outside the reach of the police and the news. After a long and exhausting road, he had finally found her lying in a hospital bed, abandoned by her own husband. The truth hit her hard. She wasn't a woman with no origin or resources, as she had always believed. She was the sole heiress to a fortune she could never have imagined. And yet, the pain of Drayton's betrayal didn't dissipate. Knowing who she really was made everything he had done seem even crueler. Mr. Sterling slid his finger across the screen and showed another type of document, bank statements. He explained that during the week Vesper was in a coma, he had investigated Drayton. The account movements revealed that he had secretly drained all their shared savings, the money Vesper had gathered dollar by dollar with so much effort. Instead of using it for her treatments or their future, he had transferred it to the account of a woman named Kaylin. That name felt painfully familiar. Kaylin was her best friend, the woman she used to eat with at home, the confidant for all her relationship problems. Vesper's body began to tremble with contained rage. Not only had she been abandoned, but she had also been betrayed by the two people she trusted most. Mr. Sterling looked at her with compassion, but firmness. He assured her she didn't need to worry about the hospital bill or where to live afterward. All her family's properties and resources were ready to return to the hands of their true owner. From that moment on, his mission would be to protect her and restore her rights and dignity. Just then, Vesper's old phone with the cracked screen vibrated on the table. Drayton's name appeared on the display. Vesper's heart started beating hard again, but this time not out of love or nostalgia, but from a mix of hate and repulsion. She looked at Mr. Sterling, asking for strength. He nodded, inviting her to answer. With a trembling hand, Vesper slid her finger over the green button and brought the phone to her ear. He didn't give her time to say a single word. Drayton's harsh voice exploded on the other end of the line. Without greetings or worries, he announced that the next day he would come to the hospital, not to see her or apologize, but accompanied by a lawyer. He wanted to speed up the divorce and made it clear with an arrogant tone. He warned her not to dream of getting a single dollar from the marital assets because, according to him, she had never contributed anything to the household economy. She was just a constant expense. Every insult was like a whip. Tears welled up again, but now they burned with rage. Vesper remained silent, listening to every word, letting Drayton empty all his poison. Beside her, Mr. Sterling clenched his fists, indignant at what he was hearing. When Drayton hung up without saying goodbye, Vesper slowly lowered the phone and fixed her gaze on the white wall. The expression in her eyes began to change. The look that was previously full of sadness and despair sharpened, cold and determined. Something new woke up in her. She was no longer the weak Vesper, blind with love. She was a betrayed wife with immense power behind her that her enemies were still unaware of. She turned to Mr. Sterling and nodded firmly. She was ready to accept her true destiny and answer for every tear she had shed. The next morning, the sun's rays filtered shyly through the curtains of the hospital room, but their warmth wasn't enough to melt the ice in the atmosphere. Vesper had gotten up before dawn, washed her face, carefully wrapped her head in a simple, neat silk scarf, and sat on the bed as upright as possible. Mr. Sterling was hiding behind the thick divider curtain, just as they had planned the night before. No one who entered should see him. His mission was to record everything that happened as irrefutable proof for the future. Vesper took a deep breath, trying to calm the whirlwind in her chest. She had to play a role, to go back to being the submissive and foolish Vesper her husband thought he knew. It didn't take long before heavy footsteps echoed in the hallway. The door burst open without a single knock of courtesy. Drayton walked in with a furrowed brow, that sour expression Vesper knew too well. But what made her blood boil wasn't him, but the woman clinging to his arm like a vine. Kaylin walked in, exaggerating every movement, hanging with familiarity onto Drayton. She was wearing flashy clothes, a brand-name purse hanging from her shoulder, an accessory Vesper knew too well she couldn't buy on a simple employee's salary unless someone had gifted it to her. Vesper lowered her gaze, hiding the flash of hate burning in her eyes and adopting a sad, pleading expression. Drayton didn't waste time asking about her health or how she felt after being on the brink of death. He walked straight to the bed, looked her up and down with a gaze of contempt, and snorted as if her presence was just one more nuisance in his schedule. He roughly threw a red folder onto Vesper's lap. The impact startled her. She didn't need to open it to know what it contained. They were the divorce papers he had promised over the phone. Drayton crossed his arms over his chest and planted himself in front of her like a cruel judge facing a defenseless defendant. He started speaking in a high, strident voice, proclaiming he was sick of taking care of a perpetually sick woman. He said Vesper was nothing more than an economic burden, slowing down his rising career. He claimed he needed a partner on his level, someone who could shine with him in front of his partners, not a basic woman who only knew how to give him problems. Every word was a knife sticking into Vesper's heart, but she swallowed them one by one without responding. Beside him, Kaylin smiled smugly. That friend who had so many times asked to borrow money was now looking at her with the arrogance of someone who thinks they've won the game. She even allowed herself to comment in a mocking tone that Vesper should have the dignity to let Drayton go so he could be happy with a more suitable woman. Vesper slowly raised her head and looked at both of them with eyes full of calculated tears. She let them slide down her cheeks, not out of sadness, but to perfect her performance. With a raspy, weak voice, she asked, "Is there really no second chance for our marriage?" The answer was a cruel laugh from Drayton. He laughed out loud as if he had heard an absurd joke. He pointed his finger at her and said there was no point in keeping trash inside the house. He stated his decision was made, and nothing and no one would change it. He urged her to sign the documents once and for all because he had much more important things to do than put up with his wife's drama. With a trembling hand, partly from contained rage and partly on purpose, Vesper opened the red folder. Her eyes scanned the clauses, all blatantly unfair. In them, she renounced any right to common assets and committed not to claim any type of alimony after the divorce. Drayton wanted to leave her on the street without a cent. She took the pen he held out to her. She held her breath for a few seconds. Inside, she promised herself that this signature wouldn't be the seal of her defeat, but the beginning of a war. She put the tip on the paper and traced her name slowly, letter by letter, over the fiscal stamp. As soon as she finished, Drayton snatched the folder from her hands as if he feared she would regret it. His face lit up with relief and satisfaction. He checked the document briefly and smiled widely at Kaylin. They looked like a couple who had just won the lottery. Drayton even allowed himself to kiss Kaylin's cheek right in front of Vesper, a scene so repulsive it almost made her stomach turn. Then he looked at her one last time and declared that from that day on they were two strangers. He warned her not to call him again and definitely not to show up at his job or his new house asking for money. He said he couldn't stand to see her face ever again. Vesper lowered her head, keeping silent, but when Drayton and Kaylin turned their backs and walked toward the door, she looked up. Her gaze no longer had a trace of sadness. It had turned cold and cutting. The moment Drayton rested his hand on the handle, she spoke in a low but clear voice, very different from the weak tone before. "Remember this second well, Drayton. You are the one kicking me out. You are the one throwing me in the trash. Don't you ever dare kneel to ask me to come back." Drayton stopped for a rigid instant. He turned his head slightly, looking at her with a furrowed brow, surprised by that change of tone. However, his arrogance wiped away any suspicion. He huffed with contempt, took Kaylin's hand, and left the room, slamming the door so hard it rumbled like the end of a painful scene in Vesper's life. When the echo faded, the curtain in the corner opened. Mr. Sterling stepped out with a serene face, though his eyes burned with anger. In his hand, he still held a small camera, turned on, which had recorded every last gesture of the traitorous couple. "Are you all right, ma'am?" he asked. Vesper wiped her hand across her cheeks to erase the last fake tears. She straightened her back, took a deep breath, and looked at him with confidence. "I'm better than ever," she said. "The trash took itself out. Get everything ready for my discharge. I'm looking forward to starting my game." Thanks to Mr. Sterling's arrangements, the hospital discharge paperwork was resolved quickly and without issues. There were no arguments over overdue bills or looks of contempt from the staff. Everything was settled. Vesper walked out the main door, but this time she didn't head to a bus stop or wait for a ride share like she would have done before. Instead, she walked toward a shiny black sedan parked in the VIP zone. A uniformed chauffeur stepped out briskly, opened the back door, and bowed with respect. It still felt strange to Vesper to receive this treatment, but she forced herself to get used to it. She climbed into the vehicle, breathing in the scent of leather and air conditioning, leaving behind the oppressive smell of the hospital. During the ride, she looked out the window. The bustling city slid past her eyes, people running, cars trapped in traffic, street vendors. And she remembered the times she had walked those same streets, exhausting herself to earn a few dollars to support Drayton. A pit of regret tried to settle in her chest, but she pushed it away. The car left the busy downtown area and entered an exclusive neighborhood, Buckhead, perhaps, where office buildings transformed into tall trees and imposing walls hiding mansions. Finally, the vehicle stopped before a giant metal gate that opened automatically. Vesper held her breath, seeing the construction rising in the background, a majestic mansion of classic architecture surrounded by an impeccable lawn and a central fountain shooting jets of crystal-clear water. Suddenly, childhood memories burst into her mind like flashes of light. She saw herself running through that garden, heard the laugh of a man lifting her in his arms near the fountain. Her eyes grew moist, this time from a deep nostalgia for parents who were no longer there. The car stopped in front of the main door. A line of domestic staff waited for her in perfect formation. As soon as Vesper stepped down, everyone bowed their heads in unison and welcomed her with a "Welcome back, ma'am," that wrapped her in warmth. For the first time in a long time, she felt she was returning to the place where she truly belonged. Mr. Sterling guided her inside. The living room remained as it was in her vague memories. Large paintings on the walls, antique furniture of high value, an atmosphere of contained elegance. But there was no time to get carried away by melancholy. Mr. Sterling reminded her that the day would be full of commitments. The first, her physical transformation. They led her to a room set up as a private beauty salon. A team of professionals, estheticians, stylists, a personal doctor, was waiting for her. For hours, Vesper was subjected to meticulous care, from skin damaged by stress to hair neglected by years of austere living with Drayton. Then came the moment to choose clothes. Mr. Sterling took her to a walk-in closet so big it far exceeded the size of her old rented apartment. Rows and rows of long dresses from prestigious designers, silk fabrics, the best quality cotton, and elegantly cut scarves and wraps hung ordered by color. There wasn't a single worn-out garment. Vesper slid her fingers over the fabrics, feeling the softness beneath her fingertips. She chose a long dress with a simple cut, but a quiet air of authority, and a matching silk head wrap. When she stood in front of the enormous full-length mirror, she almost didn't recognize herself. The woman looking back wasn't the disheveled and sad wife of a cruel man, but someone standing tall, her face illuminated and her gaze firm, radiating the presence of a leader claiming her spot. The next step was much more demanding: the internal transformation. Mr. Sterling took her to the office that had belonged to her father. Piles of folders with financial reports, organizational charts, and confidential documents cluttered the enormous desk. He explained that Langston Vance had left her the majority of shares in a huge business conglomerate, and one of the group's companies was precisely where Drayton worked. That would be her main weapon. Vesper took a seat in the leather chair that had been her father's and began to devour information. Balance sheets, command structures, profiles of the executives. Her mind, always sharp but underutilized in years of marriage, worked quickly. She focused especially on the projects Drayton managed, locating weak points, irregularities, suspicious decisions. Beside her, Mr. Sterling answered her questions and filled in the gaps with precise data. They spent the night almost awake, preparing Vesper's appearance in the corporate world, an entrance that would make Drayton's universe tremble. The next morning, in another part of the city, Drayton was living what he believed to be the best day of his life. He had just been promoted, and in the office, he was organizing a lunch for Kaylin and some colleagues to celebrate both the promotion and the recent divorce, which for him meant freedom. He laughed loudly, convinced the world was at his feet. He couldn't imagine a hurricane was heading straight for him. At 10 o'clock a.m. sharp, the hustle of the office froze. All computer screens, the televisions in the lobby, and projectors in the meeting rooms changed abruptly. The internal system had been overridden to broadcast an urgent announcement. The logo of the parent corporate group, rarely used, appeared everywhere, creating an expectant silence. Large text scrolled slowly. Important announcement. Change in ownership structure. Drayton frowned in confusion, asking his colleagues what was happening. Nobody knew. The festive atmosphere he had created vanished into tension and murmurs. The text changed. It welcomed the new owner who would arrive at the central building to perform a surprise inspection and a restructuring of the management. A chill ran down Drayton's spine for no apparent reason. He tried to convince his ego that this wouldn't have consequences for his newly premiered position. He was wrong. Outside the building, a caravan of luxury cars stopped in front of the main door. Security guards rushed out to clear the path. From the lead car, Mr. Sterling stepped out first and opened the back door. Fine heels touched the asphalt. The fabric of a long dress fluttered with elegance. Vesper stood up in front of the skyscraper, looking up toward the floor where she knew Drayton worked. She adjusted her silk wrap with a serene gesture and penetrated the lobby, receiving looks of admiration and reverence from every employee who crossed her path. The echo of her steps on the marble sounded like a countdown to the fall of those who had betrayed her. On the executive floor, the air seemed colder than ever. You could cut the tension with a knife, but Drayton, oblivious to everything, felt on top of the world. The sudden call from the executive secretary, summoning him to the main boardroom, he interpreted as a positive sign. In his head, the new owner wanted to congratulate him on his great work and maybe offer him another raise. He looked at himself in the bathroom mirror, adjusted his tie, smoothed his fresh cut, and smiled at his own image, imagining praises and flattery. He finally felt important, even more so now that he had freed himself, according to him, from the burden of Vesper. He walked down the hall toward the boardroom with his chin up, ignoring the anxious looks of some veteran employees passing by. He crossed paths with the head of HR, pale and nervous, but didn't pay it any mind. Upon arriving at the large wooden doors, he took a deep breath and, without bothering to knock, pushed them open like a winner. He expected applause, or at least polite smiles. He was met with a deadly silence. The room was spacious, dominated by a shiny oval table. All the directors and high-ranking officials were already seated in their places with tense faces, staring fixedly at their documents to avoid making eye contact with Drayton. At the head of the table, the imposing CEO chair was occupied by a figure with their back turned. The high backrest hid the new owner. Only shoulders covered by elegant fabric were visible. Next to her, standing firm like a guardian, was Mr. Sterling. Drayton recognized him as the man from the hospital, the one who had defended Vesper, but his pride led him to think he must be some assistant. To break the tension, he started speaking in a loud and confident tone, introducing himself as the best project manager in the company. He launched into a speech about his vision and commitment, as if he were at an awards ceremony. Nobody responded. There wasn't a single gesture of approval, only the echo of his own words bouncing off the soundproof walls. After a few minutes, he felt ridiculous and cut his monologue short, annoyed, demanding to know why no one was listening to him. Then, the chair at the head of the table began to turn slowly, without a sound. For Drayton, it was like a slow-motion scene from a horror movie. First, he saw a feminine hand holding an expensive pen, then the sleeve of a long silk dress, then the impeccable edge of a head wrap, and finally, a face he knew better than anyone. Time stopped for him. His eyes opened so wide they looked about to pop out of their sockets. His mouth hung half open, unable to utter a sound. The color drained from his face until he was left the shade of wax. In the seat of ultimate power sat Vesper, but not the pale hospital-smelling Vesper from days ago. This was a different Vesper, glowing, with an aura of authority that crushed his ego. Her gaze was cold and sharp. It pierced Drayton's mental defenses effortlessly. He took a step back, legs trembling, mumbling that this was impossible, that it must be a sick joke. He tried to laugh, a broken, hysterical laugh, pointing at her while screaming for someone to get that crazy woman out of there. He ordered security to expel her. He protested to the directors for allowing his ex-wife in. Cold sweat began to bead on everyone's temples. Then, Mr. Sterling stepped forward and spoke with a firm voice that cut through Drayton's hysteria. He explained that the woman seated at the head was the legitimate owner of 90% of the group's shares, the sole heiress of the parent consortium, Vesper Vance, the very same woman he had despised. Drayton's legs gave out. He barely held himself up on the back of an empty chair. The reality check was more brutal than any punch. The wife he had labeled useless and broke turned out to be the true owner of the place that gave him his livelihood. Vesper looked at him without expression, as if observing an annoying insect. With a slow but sure gesture, she picked up the dossier of the big project he had bragged about so much and held it up high for everyone to see. Then she let it drop to the floor. On purpose. The noise of the stack of papers hitting the marble sounded thunderous in the silence. It was then she spoke for the first time in that room. Her voice was calm, but every syllable contained poison for Drayton's career. She called the project trash, exactly as he had called her. She detailed one by one the failures, the data manipulations, the little corruptions that had gone unnoticed by the old management. Mr. Sterling threw a pile of audit documents onto the table that backed up every word. Vesper declared she did not plan to tolerate an incompetent manager with no morals in her company. Drayton, starting to come out of the shock, tried to defend himself. He changed his haughty tone for a pleading one, invoking their years of marriage, the moments shared, trying to awaken some compassion, but Vesper cut him off coldly. "You have two options," she said. The first, disciplinary dismissal and a contractual fine of about $35,000 for serious violations of the ethical code. The second, if you can't pay, you accept a demotion to the lowest position in the company, in the warehouse, earning minimum wage while we deduct from your check for years to pay off the debt. Drayton's face deformed. That amount of money was unreachable, even more so after having squandered his savings on the life of luxury he was leading with Kaylin. Vesper had no intention of giving him time to maneuver. She pressed a button on the intercom and asked for security presence. 2 burly guards entered instantly. "Escort the new warehouse employee to his post in the basement," she ordered calmly. Drayton was dragged out of the boardroom like a criminal, observed by the contemptuous looks of those who used to flatter him. The door closed behind him, and for Vesper, it was like closing a chapter. She returned to the meeting agenda with the board as if she had just gotten rid of a simple administrative glitch. The basement warehouse was a world apart. There was no air conditioning, no plush carpets, no expensive perfume, just suffocating heat, dust suspended under dim fluorescent lights, and the smell of cardboard and sweat. Drayton stood in the middle of the aisle in his new uniform, scratchy fabric, too tight at the waist. His dress shoes, once shiny, were covered in gray dust. He looked with despair at the endless columns of boxes rising to the ceiling. A few hours ago, he had been a boss giving orders from a comfortable chair. Now he had to lift those boxes one by one. The warehouse manager, an older man whom Drayton had humiliated many times over insignificant details, planted himself in front of him with a twisted smile of satisfaction. He gave him instructions in a tone as brusque as the one Drayton used before. He had to move 500 boxes from the unloading zone to the farthest corner before lunch break. If he didn't finish, he didn't rest. Drayton protested indignantly. That was grunt work, not for a college graduate like him. The warehouse manager shrugged and reminded him that, according to the new owner, that was exactly what he was. Just another grunt. With no choice, Drayton started carrying boxes. They were extremely heavy, full of files. After 10 boxes, his back felt broken. Sweat soaked his uniform, giving off a sour smell. His hands, accustomed to keyboards and pens, filled with blisters. Worse than the physical pain was the shame. Some former subordinates passing by recognized him. They whispered, pointing at him, laughing under their breath. They commented on the karma that had come fast for the arrogant boss, who ended up demoted to a loader. Drayton lowered his head, hiding his face behind a stack of cardboard, swallowing tears of rage. At the end of the shift, he left the building dragging his feet, his body shattered. He automatically reached for his car keys in his pocket, only to remember immediately that the vehicle was no longer where he used to park. The finance company had repossessed it that same afternoon after 3 months of missed payments. In the past, Vesper had patched those delays with extra money, but now that source had been cut off. Drayton had to get on crowded public transportation, something he hadn't done in years. The heat, the smell of sweat, the fear of pickpockets, everything irritated him. When he arrived at the luxury apartment he had rented with Kaylin a month ago, he hoped to find at least a little comfort, but upon opening the door, he was greeted by a hysterical scream. The living room was upside down with shopping bags thrown on the floor. Kaylin, her face flushed red, held several credit cards in her hand. She threw them in his face, yelling that they had all been declined at her favorite store. She had been humiliated in front of her friends. The cashier had told her the cards were blocked for lack of funds. She demanded an explanation, accusing Drayton of being useless with money. Tired and broken, Drayton exploded. He yelled at her that everything was the fault of both of their greed. He told her, waving his arms, what had happened at the office, that Vesper was the true owner, that he had been demoted to a warehouse worker, and that he carried a debt of hundreds of thousands of dollars. Kaylin showed no compassion whatsoever. On the contrary, she became even more furious. She insulted him for being stupid enough not to find out who his wife really was in all those years. The argument escalated. Reproaches and curse words were exchanged. There was no trace left of the love they had proclaimed, only fear of falling into poverty. The next day, Kaylin, unable to accept her new poor life, made an impulsive decision. Convinced that Vesper had no right to treat them like that, she applied makeup heavily, put on a dress that was already a bit worn, and showed up at the corporate group's central building. She stormed through the lobby screaming, demanding to see Vesper. The receptionist tried to stop her, but Kaylin unleashed like a fury, pushing and screeching until she caused a scene that attracted everyone's attention. She proclaimed herself a victim, accusing Vesper of robbing her of everything. She believed that if she embarrassed her in public, Vesper would be afraid and give them money. Instead, her spectacle called the queen out of her lair. The doors of the VIP elevator opened, and Vesper stepped out, accompanied by Mr. Sterling and several members of the executive team. She showed neither anger nor shame, only a cold serenity that commanded respect. The lobby went silent. Kaylin, seeing her, tried to lung at her, but 2 security guards grabbed her by the arms. She struggled, shouting insults at Vesper, demanding she return Drayton's assets. Vesper approached with a slow pace, stopping a yard from Kaylin. She didn't need to raise her voice. A firm intonation was enough for everyone to hear. "I haven't taken a single asset from Drayton," she said, "because he never had anything that wasn't mine. Everything he enjoyed was the product of my work and my money, which he and you were stealing from me." She locked eyes with Kaylin and offered a sideways smile. Then she signaled the head of security to take out the trash. The guards started dragging Kaylin toward the exit. She kicked, spitting insults. As she passed Vesper, Vesper leaned in a little and whispered in her ear with cutting coldness, "Keep your man. Take whatever is left of my ex-husband. I don't need second-hand goods with broken morals." The words pierced Kaylin's dignity like a spear. She was thrown onto the hot pavement of the street in front of the curious gaze of dozens of people. The automatic doors closed, separating a humiliated Kaylin from the interior of the building where Vesper remained in her glass tower. Kaylin broke down crying on the asphalt, aware she had lost the battle before it even started. That same night, torrential rain fell over the city, as if the sky were crying, contemplating the blackness of the human heart that was about to be completely exposed. In her spacious and cozy office, Vesper remained thoughtful, watching the drops hit the glass. Thunder rumbled in the distance, accompanying the night silence. Since taking control of the company and returning a small part of the pain they caused her to Drayton and Kaylin, She felt part of the burden had lightened. However, something still didn't fit: the cause of her sudden fall into a coma. The doctor had spoken of extreme stress and exhaustion, but her body told her otherwise. The suffering before fainting had been too strange. 3 soft knocks were heard on the door, and Mr. Sterling's voice asked permission to enter. He held a black folder in his hand, distinct from the usual colorful folders. The man's face was more serious than ever. The wrinkles on his forehead were deeply marked. He deposited the folder in front of Vesper with an almost ritual slowness, as if placing a dangerous artifact. She looked at him, seeking answers, but he only nodded, inviting her to read for herself. With a racing heart, Vesper opened the folder. The first page was a toxicology report from a prestigious private forensic lab. Her eyes scanned the lines full of medical terms until stopping at a phrase underlined in red. Traces of highly toxic chemical substances had been found in her blood, similar to rat poison and arsenic, in small doses, but lethal when accumulated. Vesper's hands began to tremble. Dizziness forced her to grab the edge of the table. This wasn't an illness or tiredness. Someone had tried to poison her slowly. She turned to the next page, hoping to discover it was all a mistake, but she found something even worse. Mr. Sterling had hired a private detective to follow Drayton and Kaylin's steps during the month prior to the coma. Those pages included slightly blurry but clear photos of Kaylin buying suspicious substances in a black market for chemicals. There were also copies of receipts for the purchase of poisons and records of containers found in her apartment's trash. The story was evident. Not only were they unfaithful, but they also conspired to kill her. Vesper suddenly remembered how weeks before getting sick, Drayton had become especially attentive with her dinners and drinks. Every night he prepared her a glass of hot milk or a relaxing tea so she would sleep better. At that moment, she had interpreted it as a gesture of affection and concern. Now, every sip transformed into one more step toward the grave he and Kaylin were digging with patience. The unbearable headaches, the constant nausea, the sudden fall into a coma, everything had an origin. The poison carefully dosed by the person sleeping next to her. Mr. Sterling, with a somber expression, explained the final motive. Drayton had secretly taken out a life insurance policy in Vesper's name worth several hundreds of thousands of dollars. If she died from a sudden illness, he, as the sole beneficiary, since her true identity hadn't been revealed yet, would collect an amount capable of financing a life of luxury abroad alongside Kaylin. Tears furrowed Vesper's face, but they were no longer of sadness, but of fury. She imagined Drayton watching her get worse day by day, maybe smiling on the inside. The plan was perfect. Without Mr. Sterling's appearance and without the medical tests, her death would have been catalogued as natural, and Drayton would be celebrating on some distant beach while she lay in an anonymous grave. Mr. Sterling asked her in a low voice what she wanted to do now. If she wished, they could go to the police immediately. With that evidence, Drayton and Kaylin could be arrested that same night. Vesper stared into the darkness behind the window, illuminated by a lightning bolt that hardened her features. She shook her head. "That would be too easy," she murmured. "Jail is too little punishment for them. I want to see them fall much lower before the bars close. I want them to taste hope, to fly a little, and then crash without being able to get up." With a serene tone but loaded with threat, she asked Mr. Sterling to keep the evidence a few more days and prepare the stage for a final theatrical act. She confessed that at first she had only wanted to ruin them financially, force them to work hard to understand what it costs to earn a living. But after knowing they wanted her dead, she changed her plan. She ensured they wouldn't just lose the money, but also their dignity, reputation, and any future prospects. She squeezed the toxicology report between her fingers, wrinkling it, and promised those tears would be the last she shed for her bad luck. The next day, she would be judge and executioner of her own past. A week passed since Drayton was demoted to the warehouse. His life alongside Kaylin sank into absolute misery. They lived in a small, damp rooming house on the outskirts, far from the luxury of the apartment before. The money left from Kaylin's savings was already gone paying debts from their unbridled lifestyle, and Drayton's check hadn't hit the account yet. They ate instant noodles, sharing a single packet between the two, saving gas carefully. The lights were cut off for non-payment frequently, and the water came out of the taps smelling of rust. Every day was a different fight. Kaylin blamed him for her ruin, and he blamed her for her excesses. That night, Drayton was sitting on a thin, smelly mattress thrown on the floor, thinking about the fine of hundreds of thousands of dollars he could never pay. If he didn't, he would be condemned to be a wage slave forever or end up in jail. In the middle of his anguish, the phone rang. He received a message from Vesper. His heart almost stopped. With trembling fingers, he opened the conversation. The text was brief, but for him, it was like an oasis in the middle of the desert. Vesper was inviting him to dinner. She said that after reflecting, maybe she had been too harsh and wanted to talk about a possible reconciliation and withdrawing the fine. Drayton jumped for joy. He woke up Kaylin, who was sleeping with her back to him, and showed her the message with shining eyes. Exalted, he assured her his plan had worked. He was convinced Vesper still loved him. He said a woman that naive couldn't hate him for long, that surely she had only acted under the influence of those around her. Kaylin suspected a trap at first, but her desire to return to a life of luxury drowned out any prudence. Drayton convinced her it was the great opportunity to fix everything. If he managed to bamboozle Vesper again, they would get part of her fortune, or at least get rid of the debt. They started getting ready, although they had almost no decent clothes left. Many of their best outfits had been sold to buy food. Drayton dusted off an old, wrinkled suit that smelled of dampness. Kaylin borrowed a dress from a neighbor in the boarding house. Although it was a bit big on her, she applied makeup with the remnants of cosmetics she had left, trying to cover the tiredness on her face. In front of a cracked mirror, they encouraged each other, convincing themselves they still looked like a high-class couple. Drayton combed his hair, rehearsed his sweetest smile and his most pleading look, the same ones that had melted Vesper's heart before. They spent the last bills they had on a taxi to get to the five-star hotel where she had summoned them. Upon entering the lobby, they felt small. The crystal chandeliers, the impeccable attention of the staff, and the elegant guests made them feel out of place. But Drayton squeezed Kaylin's hand, urging her to keep her head high. A receptionist led them to a private room on an upper floor. He interpreted that special attention as a sign that Vesper wanted to reconcile. In his imagination, he already saw her asking for forgiveness, crying in his arms, and begging him to return to run the company. A waiter opened the doors of the room. The room was beautifully decorated with fresh flowers and a table set with care. At the back, on a small stage lit with soft light, was Vesper. She wore a modest but luxurious evening gown, and her bearing commanded respect. She wasn't smiling, but Drayton interpreted her neutral face as containing emotion. There was no other guest, just Vesper, a few motionless waiters, and the echo of their own footsteps. The silence of the room seemed solemn to him, almost sacred. He let go of Kaylin's hand and advanced toward the stage, adopting a remorseful expression he had rehearsed. His eyes grew moist in a calculated way. He called Vesper by her name in a soft tone and began to recite a melodramatic speech, that he was sorry, that he suffered without her, that he had understood she was the only woman he had ever loved. Kaylin remained a few steps back with her head slightly lowered, feigning regret according to the script he had dictated. As he got closer, Drayton saw that Vesper didn't move or pull away. He took it as a sign she was yielding. When he could almost touch her, he opened his arms prepared to hug her, and with that gesture closed the trap. But at the last second, Vesper took a firm step back. Her face changed. It was no longer expressionless, but openly disgusted. She raised her hand, with her palm extended between them like a barrier. With a clear voice that resonated through the whole room, she ordered, "Stop! Don't you dare touch me with those dirty hands!" Drayton froze, arms still open, his smile turning into a grimace. Before he could ask what was happening, Vesper pointed to something behind him. A large screen descended from the ceiling, projecting white light onto the walls. "Before talking about love or forgiveness," she said, Watch this." The lights in the room went out suddenly, leaving only the glow of the screen. Drayton's heart began to beat against his ribs with violence. On the screen appeared a sharp image of a kitchen, their old house. In a corner, dated a month prior, Kaylin was clearly seen from behind pouring a powder from a small packet into a glass of milk. Beside her, he himself was stirring the liquid with a spoon, laughing. Then the images showed how they placed the glass on Vesper's nightstand, commenting on the dose, joking that this way it would all be over sooner, and talking about the trips to Europe they would take with the insurance money. Drayton felt his legs stop responding. He tried to shake his head, but his jaw locked. Every laugh of his, amplified by the speakers, now stabbed into his own ears. Kaylin fell to the floor on her knees, pale, hands over her mouth to stifle a scream. When the video ended, the screen went black and the silence became denser than ever. Drayton swallowed hard, trying to improvise an excuse, to say it was a montage, a digital manipulation. Before he could articulate a word, all the lights in the room turned on at full power. Drayton blinked, blinded. When his eyes adjusted, he discovered the room wasn't empty. At the tables, in the shadows he hadn't seen before, sat dozens of people. In the front row, the company's main investors, the board of directors that had demoted him, and several veteran partners of Langston Vance, all looking at him with a contempt that froze him. To one side, a group of journalists wielded cameras and microphones, recording every one of his reactions. Near the door, lined up, several police officers in uniform waited for instructions. It wasn't a reconciliation dinner. It was a public trial, designed by Vesper to strip their crimes bare before the world. She didn't just want to stop them. She wanted to ensure they never raised their heads again, without everyone remembering who they were. Vesper watched him kneeling, as she had predicted. She remembered what she had told him in the hospital. Never to kneel, to ask her to come back. Now she had him prostrate, but not out of love, but out of fear. She took the microphone Mr. Sterling handed her. Her voice filled the room, serene but relentless. She explained to those present that what they had just seen was the reason she had been so harsh with her ex-husband. She said perhaps she could forgive infidelity and even theft of money, but never a premeditated attempted murder. Drayton tried to crawl to her feet with tears on his face, claiming he had gotten carried away, that he hadn't thought it through, that it was all Kaylin's idea. He pointed at her, trying to load the guilt onto her. Kaylin, who until then was trembling in silence, reacted like a beast. She launched herself at him, hitting him, scratching him, screaming that it had been Drayton who took out the insurance, who insisted on increasing the poison dose, who planned everything. The journalists didn't stop taking photos. The guests looked away, disgusted by that spectacle. Vesper signaled the lead officer. The commander advanced with handcuffs in hand. Before they took Drayton away, she asked for a moment. She pulled a crumpled and laminated sheet out of her purse, the note he had left her on the hospital nightstand, the one where he abandoned her, and ordered her to pay the expenses alone. She approached slowly, leaning in to keep her distance, and slid the note into the pocket of Drayton's suit. "This letter," she whispered, "is the final proof. It's your own handwriting, your own confession, that you left me to die alone. It's the perfect complement to the video to prove you wanted my death." The click of the handcuffs closing around his wrists sounded to him like the end of all hope. Drayton looked at Vesper one last time, seeing the woman he had despised converted into a queen surrounded by respect. He was nothing more than a criminal on his way to jail. The police took Drayton and Kaylin away amidst the incessant flashing of cameras. Nothing remained of their arrogance or their ostentatious lifestyle. That night marked the end of their story and the beginning of Vesper's true freedom. She watched them until they disappeared behind the door. Then she let out a long sigh, as if expelling all the ghosts of the past from her chest. Symbolically, it was Chapter 10 of her life, the one of karma and freedom. 6 months after that arrest shook the newspapers. The wheel of life had turned completely, putting everyone in the place they deserved. In a maximum security prison, Drayton huddled in a corner of a cold, damp cell. The cement walls were now his only company. He had been sentenced to 20 years for attempted homicide and insurance fraud. But the bars weren't his only punishment. The weight of the fall, from luxury to contempt, had broken his mind and body. He suffered a mild stroke a month after entering prison, leaving half his body partially paralyzed. The corner of his mouth drooped to one side, and he spoke with difficulty. Every day he looked at the cell door expecting a visit from someone. No one came. His former co-workers had erased him from their memory or laughed at him in private. His family, ashamed, cut all contact. Kaylin, the woman for whom he risked everything, was imprisoned in another center where it was said she starred in constant fights with other inmates. Drayton was truly alone. At night, in the silence broken only by prison noises, Vesper's figure appeared to him again and again. He remembered how she massaged his feet after long shifts, how she prepared his favorite meals, how she took care of him when he had a fever. Regret whipped him like a raging sea against a rock. He cried without sound, tears mixing with the dirt on the floor. He understood now how stupid he had been to throw away a diamond to pick up a rock, just as Mr. Sterling said. He had had a perfect, generous, and rich wife, and he lost her out of ambition and lust. Now sick and crippled, there was no one to feed him or clean him. His hell was the result of his own decisions, and he would have to inhabit it for long years. On the other end of the city, at the very top of a modern skyscraper, Vesper leaned on the railing of her office terrace. The afternoon breeze caressed her face and gently moved the fabric of her silk wrap. At her feet lay the city illuminated by a golden sunset. She had earned respect not just as an heiress, but as a firm and fair businesswoman. Under her leadership, her father's companies had grown solidly. However, her greatest achievement wasn't in the numbers, but in the foundation she had just inaugurated a week prior. This foundation was dedicated to helping women victims of domestic violence and single mothers abandoned by their partners. Vesper didn't want any other woman to feel as helpless as she had felt in that hospital bed. It offered legal advice, professional training, and seed money for small businesses. Every time she saw a woman recover her smile, stand up, and build a new life distant from abuse, she felt a satisfaction much deeper than any financial profit. Her heart, once full of wounds, was now filled with purpose. There was no space left for resentment. The glass doors of the terrace opened, and Mr. Sterling stepped out with 2 cups of steaming tea. He wore an expression of serene pride on his face. He placed one of the cups on the table and stood beside her, contemplating the horizon. In his mind, he remembered the first time he saw her in the hospital, fragile and broken, and he couldn't help but be amazed at the powerful and compassionate woman standing before him now. He felt he had finally honored the promise he made to Langston Vance, to find and protect his daughter. After a few minutes of shared silence, he looked at Vesper and asked her a simple question, but one loaded with meaning. "Happy, ma'am?" Vesper stayed quiet for a few seconds, letting the question float in the air. She took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the sensation of freedom that had cost her so much. In the past, she had placed her happiness in Drayton's hands. She believed her life only had meaning if she pleased him. Today she understood that true happiness isn't begged for, it's built. It doesn't depend on a husband or a title, but on feeling at peace with oneself and being able to do good. She turned to Mr. Sterling with the brightest smile he had ever seen on her. "I am very happy," she responded firmly, "because my happiness no longer depends on someone loving me or approving of me. It's mine. I built it with my own effort and with every tear I shed." She raised the cup as if toasting to the future. She observed the sky dyeing itself in orange and golden tones. Her story of pain had reached its end. A new page full of hope opened before her. She took a sip of tea and felt its warmth expanding through her whole body. She was ready to receive tomorrow with a light heart and a free soul. If you've made it this far, you already know this isn't just Vesper's story. It's the story of anyone who was ever betrayed, underestimated, or treated like trash, and yet decided to get up and recover their dignity. Did you like the story, and which city are you listening from? Let's meet in the comments. If you liked the story, you can support me by sending a super thanks so I can keep bringing more stories like this. Thank you so much for your sweet support. I'm looking forward to your comments on the story. On the screen, you can see 2 new life stories that I highly recommend. There's so much more on my channel. Don't forget to subscribe. See you in the next life story with love and respect.
My thoughts on the story. This story is a truly unexpected and poignant twist, making me both emotional and reflecting on hasty decisions in life. It revolves around a woman in a difficult situation, perhaps a divorce or marital crisis, when a stranger approaches her and tells her that her husband has made a big mistake. At first, you think this is a typical betrayal or deception story, but then someone was really shocked by him reveals a different truth. Her husband is not a bad guy, but someone who has made a silent sacrifice, perhaps turning down a big opportunity to be with his family, or hiding a secret to protect her. The moment I realized that truth, I felt my heart sink, not because of tragedy, but because of the belated joy of a misunderstanding being resolved. It serves as a reminder that, behind the surface mistakes, there are often hidden acts of love. I love how the story is told through the lens of a stranger, creating a sense of mystery and authenticity, like a random encounter at a coffee shop or a park. It's not long, but it's enough to evoke emotions, from anger and doubt to forgiveness and gratitude. Overall, it's an inspiring story about empathy, and it makes me want to hug my loved ones more, because sometimes we only see the tip of the iceberg. Lessons learned. From this surprising story, I learned a few valuable lessons that help us look at relationships more deeply. Don't judge based on the surface. Strangers tell stories about the husband's big mistake, but in truth, it was a heroic act. Lesson learned. In marriage or any relationship, stop to listen to the whole story before jumping to conclusions. Small misunderstandings can lead to big hurt if we don't dig deeper. Sacrifices are often silent. The husband may have chosen to be with his wife instead of pursuing the golden opportunity, and it is mistaken for selfishness. Lesson. Cherish the people who love you. They may be suffering for you without saying so. A sincere conversation can reveal the real shock behind the normal appearance. Random encounters can change lives. Strangers are the unexpected messengers who help resolve conflicts. Lesson. Life is full of strange moments. Be open to others, as they may bring a perspective that saves a relationship. And remember, sometimes you can be the stranger who changes someone's life.